Hello everyone and welcome back to my series on the Wars of the Roses. Before we begin, let's recap what happened in the last episode. The Kingdom of England is being ruled by King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster, a dynasty that came to the throne in slightly less than legal circumstances. Henry is weak-willed, easily manipulated and has a thorough distaste for war, all traits that are not good for kings to have. In addition to this, the crown is undergoing a crisis, partly Henry's fault and partly not, that has resulted in the deterioration of royal power across the country and the loss of much of France. As discontent towards the royal court is built up, Richard, Duke of York and the heir to the throne, has positioned himself as the man who should be really running the country. This stance has put him at loggerheads with a court faction that has been controlling Henry and growing rich off his back, led by Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort. The year is now 1453. All of York's attempts to have his claims recognised have been frustrated by the court faction, and he is stuck in the political wilderness. He realises that he cannot win his battle with Somerset as long as he acts alone, and starts looking for allies among the other great magnates. Latin for great man, the term magnate is used to refer to the powerful regional lords in England and elsewhere that were capable of defying the monarch. We've already seen a fair few magnates by this point in the series. Henry IV was one, as was John of Gaunt. Richard of York was also one of the most prominent in his day. All in all, the 15th century was a golden age for England's magnates, primarily because of the House of Lancaster's reliance on them to properly administer the country. However, the magnates' ideas of administration tended to involve considerably more violence and self-interest than the populace on the whole wanted. All that said, it can be very hard to tell the difference between a lord who is powerful and another who is a magnate. It's a real how many trees there's a forest situation, so I'm going to try and stick with the guys that historians generally consider to be magnates, but bear in mind there may be some figures that pop up that claim the title slightly more dubiously. However, the magnates that matter to us right now are the members of two very prominent noble families, the houses of Neville and Percy. The two houses were locked in a feud, and it's all to do with maps. Although I've shown you maps until this point with nice neat lines delineating borders, this is a little misleading. I'm not sure how many of you have seen a border in real life, but unless you live in the United States, you may have noticed that borders don't really appear as giant lines. In a medieval world without GPS and other such newfangled things, the problem of where borders were was even more prominent. So when you see a map like this one, the black line means that the border is sort of vaguely in that area, but may in reality extend for many miles in either direction. The Scottish-English border is the prime example of this, with the border crossed willy-nilly by traders, farmers, peddlers and the like, and slightly more unsavoury people like bandits and armies fighting one of the many, many wars fought between the two countries before they united. With all this toing and froing at the borders, it was hard, if not impossible, for the government in London to properly administer the place. Hence they essentially subcontracted the defence of the border regions to noble families by giving them special lordships called marches. Marches came with increased responsibilities, but also a number of privileges to incentivise the owners. The main benefits were that marches were exempt from the king's authority and allowed the owners to raise troops without asking the monarch first, which was a pretty big deal considering that no one else could do this. On the downside, if you owned a march, you were required to staff and maintain castles and fortifications along the border, which could be pretty enormous and expensive. Likewise, you were required to try to stop raiders from burning and looting indiscriminately, and should someone invade, you are going to end up on the front lines. But make no mistake, the benefits of owning a march massively outweigh the drawbacks, and having one was the goal of many a noble family. This brings us back around to the Nevilles and the Percys. The Scottish marches were divided into three: West, Middle and East. By the time of the Wars of the Roses, the Nevilles were the wardens of the West March, and the Percys were the wardens of the East March. This meant that both families were eternally competing with each other for resources, land and people, and thus had developed a rivalry that had lasted for centuries. The particular dispute that was raging between the two houses during the Wars of the Roses had a far more recent origin. Remember that rebellion that I mentioned in the previous episode where Edmund Mortimer tried to press his claim on the throne after Henry IV overthrew Richard II? Well, the main backers behind that rebellion were the Percys, and after its disastrous failure, Henry had their estates and titles stripped and handed out to other noble families, with a number going to the House of Neville. Although the Percys eventually managed to convince the crown to return most of their lands during Henry V's reign, they were never able to get all of them back, and thus started legal proceedings with the Nevilles to regain their territory. However, in August 1453, when it looked like the Nevilles would gain more Percy lands through a marriage, the family's patience snapped and they launched an attack on the wedding party. Though the attack failed, it amounted to a declaration of war by the Percys against the Nevilles, and thus triggered a low-intensity war of skirmishes and raids across much of the north. We're now going to jump back down south, for the dispute between the Percys and Nevilles occurred just as York was in need of allies. As 1453 began, things were actually looking up for the government. Somerset had turned out to not be completely useless, and an English army was campaigning in France, led by the renowned commander John Talbot. Furthermore, in the spring, Queen Margaret declared that she was pregnant with the king's child. This was seriously bad news for York, as one of the strongest cards in his hand was the whole heir to the throne thing. So if she gave birth to a girl, he was safe, but if it was a boy, he was done for. All in all, things were slowly on the upswing for the country in general. It looked like the crisis of 1450 was just a blip. And then it all went horrendously wrong. The cause was the war in France. That English army we mentioned earlier ended up attacking a French artillery position outside the town of Castellon in Gascony. Unfortunately for Talbot, it turned out the entire French military was encamped behind it, and the English forces ended up being annihilated. The defeat definitively ended not only Talbot's life, but also any hope that the English crown could recover their lands in France, thereby ending the 100 Years' War, 116 years after it started. Upon receiving the devastating news, King Henry slipped into a catatonic stupor, during which he was utterly unaware of the world around him, doing little other than existing for day after day, week after week, month after month. By complete coincidence, all of this had happened just as the Neville-Percy dispute broke out into open warfare. Extreme doormat though Henry was, at least he still did stuff. Now he wasn't even capable of that. It became apparent that a regent or Lord Protector needed to be appointed to rule in Henry's stead. Somerset intended to take the protectorship for himself, and in March 1454 convened a council of all the major peers, omitting York of course, to assent to the decision. However, at the council, the two Neville peers, Richard Earl of Salisbury and his son, Richard Earl of Warwick, outmanoeuvred Somerset and had Richard of York declared regent. You see, unbeknownst to Somerset, York and the Nevilles had agreed upon an alliance. The Nevilles would assist York in his struggle against Somerset if he used his position as regent to assist them in their war with the Percys. The political stage had been flipped upside down now that York was in control of the country. One of his first acts was to consign Somerset to the Tower, removing his great rival from the political scene. He then rewarded the Nevilles for upholding their part of the deal. First, Salisbury was made Chancellor, one of the highest ranking positions in the country. As for the Percy family, without royal protection, they began to have the ever-loving crap kicked out of them by the Nevilles, which was capped off by two of their leaders being imprisoned in the autumn. Although York was now on top, it could not last. First of all, Queen Margaret gave birth to a son called Edward, immediately knocking York down the line of succession. Far more troubling was that on Christmas Day 1454, Henry recovered from his madness, reportedly upon seeing his son. Although it took a few months for the king to fully recover, by February 1455 York's protectorate was over. Somerset and the Percys were released from jail, and control of the king once more passed into the hands of Somerset and the Queen, who now hated York more than ever. Defeated, York and the Nevilles left London without notifying the king, and returned to their northern estates to plan their next move. However, Somerset and his new allies, the Percys, were determined to retain the advantage, and finally put an end to York's ambitions now that he was on the back foot. They persuaded the king to convene a great council in May 1455. The wording of the summons stated that the council should meet to discuss the safety of the king against anyone who would threaten it. Attendance was not optional. York smelled a trap and came to believe that if he were to attend the meeting without any guards, it would surely end with his imprisonment or execution. To preempt this, he came up with a plan. He would intercept the king's party en route from London to Leicester, where the council was to be held, and take the king into his protection. He sent word of his plan to Salisbury and Warwick, and all three began to call out their armies, or retainers. The court faction received word of York's intentions and had the king send a letter to the three lords, ordering them to disband their armies or be considered traitors. However, the demand was ignored, and York, Salisbury and Warwick all proceeded south towards London with an army of around 3,000 men-at-arms. Somerset freaked out when he heard about this. Londoners were hostile towards the court, and he realised that any confrontation with York must take place away from the capital. With that in mind, on the 21st of May, the court party set off from Westminster for Leicester, stopping off at the small town of St Albans first, where they would meet with various friendly lords and their own forces who would escort them the rest of the way. As plans go, it was probably the only one available to Somerset. However, it had two massive flaws. Firstly, York and the Nevilles were far closer than anyone at court had suspected. Secondly, York's spies had informed them not only was the royal party stopping at St Albans, but that they would be there for a full day before any reinforcements showed up. With that in mind, the three lords hid their forces in the area around St Albans and set a trap. At around 9 AM on the 22nd of May, the royal party marched into St Albans and halted, as predicted. York then had all roads out blocked off and surrounded the town. There then followed a flurry of letters between the two sides, York demanding that the king hand over Somerset and the royal party demanding that York and the Nevilles disband their armies. While this was going on, York was being pushed into action by the Nevilles, as the head of the Percy family, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, was present in the royal party. Likewise, York had noticed that the defenders were hurriedly reinforcing the town's small defences as the negotiations dragged on, making him believe that it was all simply a delaying tactic, and that Somerset was the one really writing the king's missives. Meanwhile, in St Albans, the king replaced Somerset as commander with Humphrey Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who was seen as a more neutral party in the hopes that he could persuade York to leave the field. However, this gesture led to nothing, and having finally grown fed up, York ordered his troops to attack the defenders during the late morning, triggering the Battle of St Albans, which means the Wars of the Roses have officially begun. Though caught by surprise, the defenders managed to regroup and hold off the first wave of attacks. While St Albans was hardly Fort Knox, it did have a few defensive features, namely a ditch that ran around the town and barricades covering the main roads. These barricades were the Lancastrians' strongest defence, as they forced the Yorkists to attack down the narrow streets, negating their numerical advantage. After an hour or so of the Yorkists ineffectually trying to batter their way through the barricades, Warwick noticed that the Lancastrians did not have enough men to properly man the ditch surrounding St Albans, and had left large, undefended gaps. Seizing the opportunity, he gathered up a party from his rearguard and led them in a charge over the ditch and through the back gardens to the main square, which the court had been using as a rest area / command post. Warwick and his men caught the defenders completely by surprise, with a number of Lancastrians supposedly not even wearing helmets. When the defenders at the barricades realised what had happened, they collapsed almost immediately, with most fleeing the field, allowing the rest of the Yorkist army to pour in down the undefended lanes. Despite this catastrophic train of events, the remnants of the Lancastrians, led by Stafford, attempted to regroup in the town square to defend the king. However, Warwick had grown tired of the fighting and ordered a group of his archers to fire on the party from close range, killing most of them and wounding the rest, including, shockingly, King Henry himself, who was hit in the neck. Amazingly, Stafford took a longbow arrow to the face and survived. With that, the battle was over, as the remains of the Lancastrians either surrendered or ran away. As for Somerset, he had taken refuge in a tavern just off the main street. Knowing that York would never take him alive, he charged out, killing 4 of his attackers before being felled by a halberd and hacked to pieces. An interesting thing about Somerset's death was that he had long had a premonition that he was going to die in the shadow of a castle. As he lay dying on the street, he noticed that the sign hanging from the tavern he had been hiding in read, "Castle Inn." With the Lancastrians shattered, York and Salisbury took King Henry into their protection and left for London the following morning. York was elated. One battle achieved everything that years of political manoeuvring had failed to do. He was once more in charge of the government, his greatest rival was dead, and the court faction was scattered and leaderless. However, you could argue that the real winners of St Albans were the Nevilles. Not only was their ally now in power, but Northumberland had been cut down during the chaos of the Lancastrian rout. With the Percys now rudderless, they looked to have won their war. Warwick also won big, as his decisive actions throughout the battle had won him fame and renown across the kingdom, all at the age of 25. Join me again next time, as we see the aftermath of the Battle of St Albans, and the kingdom finally slides into full-scale civil war.